Hey guys, welcome back to GX Stories Sleeping. Tonight we drift back to a world where the line between justice and absurdity gets, well, very, very blurry. Imagine this: a hushed medieval courtroom, rows of solemn townspeople, and in the center, under heavy guard, a pig in a frilly tunic. It snorts, it oinks, it's on trial for murder. That's not a dream. That's history. Tonight, you'll follow along in the footsteps of a world that quite literally put animals in the dock. And not symbolically either. We're talking full legal proceedings, court-appointed lawyers, witnesses, public executions, trials that felt more like theater than justice. You probably won't survive this, because if a chicken can get the death penalty for unnatural egg laying, what chance do you have? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you all listen from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins in a sleepy French village sometime in the 1300s. The scent of manure and baked rye bread mixes with a damp breeze. Someone's shouting in the town square, calling for witnesses. You shuffle over, half curious, half wary, and discover that a trial is about to begin. Not for a thief, not for a murderer, for a pig. A big, mud-slicked, confused pig. You blink. Maybe you misheard. But no, there it is, tethered to a post beside the magistrate. Its ears twitch. Its eyes are dull. It doesn't look particularly murderous, but word on the street is that it mauled a baby to death. You wonder how. You wonder why. You wonder who decided this pig deserves a full trial, rather than a roasting spit. The answer is both incredibly medieval and weirdly logical, at least in the eyes of a society steeped in divine order. You see, people back then genuinely believed that animals were part of the moral universe. If they sinned, they had to be judged. A pig who committed violence was not merely dangerous, it was corrupt, and corruption had to be punished. The pig gets a defense attorney, a real one. The poor guy, dressed in faded robes and carrying a sheaf of parchment, actually has to argue that the pig didn't mean it, or that it was provoked, or perhaps even that the child's family was negligent. As if the pig is sitting there thinking, "I regret my actions deeply, Your Honor." It's surreal, but the crowd takes it seriously. Because in this world, justice isn't just for humans. Animals, after all, were part of God's creation. And if one broke the rules, it reflected something bigger. Maybe God's displeasure. Maybe the devil's influence. Or maybe, just maybe, a community in desperate need of a scapegoat. Or in this case, a scape pig. Some trials took hours. Others dragged on for days. There would be witness testimonies. "Yes, I saw the sow near the cradle." Or, "She's always been temperamental." The judge would ponder legal codes pulled from Roman law, church doctrine, and good old-fashioned superstition. And then, the verdict. Guilty. The pig is sentenced to death, sometimes by hanging, sometimes by burning. And occasionally, if the town felt especially theatrical, they dressed the animal in human clothes first. A strange way of underscoring guilt, or maybe of comforting themselves that the punishment made sense. One quirky tidbit that pops up in some records: the executioner had to be paid extra to kill animals because it was seen as morally complicated work. As if hanging a man was one thing, but hanging a pig? That was murkier somehow. And historians still debate whether these trials were about genuine belief or social pressure. Were people truly convinced the pig had sinned? Or was it more about keeping the public calm, giving them a story, a punishment, a sense of control in a chaotic world? Whatever the reason, you stand there as the pig is led away. The townspeople cross themselves, a child cries, and you realize with a queasy twist that this wasn't an isolated event. This was law. And you're not in Kansas anymore. The next morning, your feet ache from the uneven cobblestones as you shuffle through another town square, different village, same eerie sense that logic's been turned inside out. The air smells like cabbage and wood smoke. You're hoping for something normal, maybe a market or a juggler, but instead you find a gathering crowd surrounding a cart. On it stands a small wide-eyed goat tied to a post, chewing its cud as if utterly oblivious. A clerk is reading something aloud. You lean in. Words like maleficium, desecration, and culpability float toward you. Wait, is the goat on trial for ruining crops? It is. You blink again. The goat apparently wandered into a consecrated field, trampled several rows of barley, and relieved itself near a holy well. It may not sound criminal to you, but to the local authorities, it's a divine affront. This goat didn't just cause damage, it offended the cosmic order. In a world where disease, famine, and death come with little explanation, people grab at whatever thread offers a pattern. Blame is soothing, and if it lands on a creature with horns and horizontal pupils, all the better. You can't really imprison a drought or summon locusts to court, but a goat, that at least stands still. You hear murmurs among the villagers how the devil lives in hoofed things, or how the signs have been bad since the goat came. It sounds theatrical, even paranoid, but there's an emotional logic at work here. Something bad happens, so something must be responsible. It's easier to stomach catastrophe if there's a face or a snout you can direct your anger toward. This is where medieval society leaned on what scholars call animistic justice, a belief that every living thing holds moral agency. It's not just about superstition. There's a framework here shaped by theology and fear. If humans sin, animals can sin too, and so they must also answer to the same systems of judgment. A lawyer stands to defend the goat, and this poor man doesn't have it easy. Because while legal documents of the time might sound like something out of Monty Python, they were often obsessively detailed. A goat might be accused of willful sabotage or desecrating sacred ground with intent. Proving lack of intent? Not easy when your client just stares into the distance and occasionally bleats. And then comes the fringe detail. In some cases, the goat might be offered absolution. If a priest deems it an instrument of Satan rather than a willing participant, it could be spared and blessed. Yes, you heard that right. The same creature facing death one day might be sprinkled with holy water the next. Talk about mixed signals. But in most cases, the verdict leans toward guilt. The goat's fate could be grim. Public execution again. Sometimes even stoning if the village wanted to vent a little extra frustration. It's brutal and surreal. But for the crowd, it's not about the goat anymore. It's about order, about feeling that justice, however bizarre, has been served. Modern historians still argue over what all of this really meant. Was it genuine theology? Psychological coping? A mix of social pressure and symbolic performance? No one agrees. But one thing's clear. Animals made for convenient culprits in a world that often couldn't explain itself. You watch as the goat is led away. It doesn't seem to understand the weight of what just happened. And maybe that's the scariest part. It was judged by rules it couldn't even comprehend. Like, standing in a courtroom where the language isn't just foreign, it's from a different species entirely. And as the crowd disperses, grumbling about omens and bad harvest, you can't shake the feeling that today's trial won't be the last. There are plenty more animals in town, and a lot of blame still floating in the air. By the time you reach the next village, the absurdity is starting to feel normal. You half expect a duck to be giving legal testimony, but instead there's a hush, an eerie kind of reverence, hanging over the crowd in the square. Something important is happening. Important and ridiculous. You spot the accused immediately. It's another pig. Hefty sow this time, with coarse, bristled hair and a crooked ear. But this one isn't in chains. It's in a dress. A real, ruffled, human-style dress, draped awkwardly over its bulk, and it's wearing a bonnet, tied loosely under its jowls. You squint, half expecting this to be some kind of macabre street performance. But no, the town has gathered for a proper legal proceeding, and the pig, well, she's the defendant. The charge? Murder again. A child, no older than 3, wandered into the pigsty. What happened next is vague. Some say the pig attacked unprovoked. Others whisper about negligence. But regardless of the facts, the outcome is locked. The community wants a reckoning, and this sow is going to trial. One of the stranger facts of medieval jurisprudence, pigs were the most frequently tried animals in Europe. They lived close to people, roamed freely through streets and homes, and had unfortunate habits, like rooting around in garbage or, more horrifyingly, unsupervised infants. Because yes, pigs are omnivores, and accidents, or worse, did happen. What shocks you is how meticulous the process is. The judge reads aloud the formal charges. The prosecution describes the victim's injuries in detail. Witnesses are called, neighbors, the child's mother, even a local blacksmith who insists he saw a devilish look in the pig's eyes. The courtroom might be drafty and damp, but this is serious business. And then, because this is medieval France, the pig gets a defense attorney. Not a symbolic one either. A real trained advocate, versed in both Roman and canon law, who rises solemnly and begins to argue on behalf of the animal. His position? That the pig acted instinctively, that no malice can be proven, and that, get this, the victim may have been trespassing in the pig's space. You almost laugh, but no one else does. Because in this world, legal ritual matters more than common sense. Every soul, human or not, is part of God's dominion. And if justice applies to one, it must apply to all. Now for a truly quirky tidbit. Not only were pigs sometimes dressed in clothing, but this was thought to reinforce their symbolic personhood in the eyes of the court. If the sow looked more human, perhaps it would be easier to judge her according to human laws. Scholars still debate whether this was done to mock the animal, or to sanctify the process. No one's quite sure. The trial drones on. The defense offers character witnesses, neighbors who claim the pig had never acted aggressively before. One elderly woman swears she used to feed it crusts of bread, and that it never once bit me. You're struck by the sheer theatricality of it all. This isn't just a trial, it's a performance, a ritual of punishment. And in a time when divine wrath could be read in every storm, every sickness, every failed harvest, maybe this was how people negotiated guilt, by holding something accountable, even if it couldn't understand a single word. Eventually, the verdict comes. Guilty. The sentence, public hanging. And while that sounds insane by modern standards, it was common in parts of medieval Europe. Executioners would construct gallows just tall enough for a pig's weight, often in the town square where everyone could witness the act. Not just justice, but instruction. One French record from 1386 describes such an execution, where a sow was hanged in front of an audience that included the mayor, the bailiff, and multiple clergymen. Justice, they believed, was being served. Order was being restored. And you're left with a haunting image of the pig, clothed, shackled, and completely unaware, as it's led to the gallows. It grunts once, loudly, then follows the rope without resistance. You wake the next day to the sharp clanging of a church bell, not calling for prayer, but for testimony. Another trial, another crowd, but this one is different. There's a strange anticipation in the air, and when you arrive at the edge of the square, you see something that makes you rub your eyes. A donkey, standing beside the judge's bench, calm, tethered gently, and very much not the defendant. No, today, the donkey is a witness. It turns out the defendant is a man, accused of inappropriate acts with an animal, and the donkey is here to testify to the animal's unwillingness. You don't know whether to laugh or back away slowly, but no one else seems to find this strange. In fact, the court clerk is carefully reading from a scroll, noting the donkey's temperament and behavior. Apparently, the defense attorney has built part of his case around the donkey's modesty and innocence. He insists that the animal's calm demeanor and lack of signs of corruption proves that the real sin lies with the human alone. It's one of those moments where history briefly collapses into pure theater. A courtroom takes seriously the emotional disposition of a farm animal. And even stranger, the donkey's apparent virtue may actually help the man's case. This isn't some isolated moment of rural madness either. There are real documented cases, especially from medieval France and Italy, where animals were brought in as character witnesses, sometimes to defend themselves, other times to help clear or damn a human. Judges would observe their reactions, priests might even bless them, looking for signs of divine approval or resistance. In some cases, the animals would be presented as evidence of innocence simply because they appeared docile and unafraid. One such case, from the mid-1700s, recounts a donkey being praised by the court for its exemplary behavior. and the villagers themselves rallied to its moral defense. So yes, while you're standing there thinking, this is absolutely bonkers, know that for the people present, this was legal theater with spiritual weight. It ties into the broader medieval worldview that animals were not just functional, they were symbolic. A lamb could represent purity, a wolf, greed or evil, a donkey, patience, endurance, and apparently, virtue. If an animal could be stained by sin, then it made sense, at least to them, that it could also be vindicated. Of course, scholars today can't agree on how seriously people took all of this. Some believe these trials were half satire, half control mechanism, ways to keep restless populations distracted and invested in authority. Others argue that people did believe animals could reflect divine signs, and that justice required attention to all creatures under heaven. And then there's the possibility no one really knew what they believed. In a world of famine, disease, and superstition, what mattered most was the ritual, the appearance of order being maintained. If that meant listening to a donkey's behavior as testimony, then so be it. As the trial wraps up, you hear the judge pronounce that the donkey bears no sign of moral corruption and should be returned to its owner. The human defendant, however, isn't so lucky. But the strangest part? The crowd claps. A light, respectful applause, as if justice, however peculiar, has been done. The donkey is led away, hooves clopping gently against the stone, and for a brief moment, you feel like it knows something you don't. Something about the quiet absurdity of being used as a tool in a legal system you'll never fully understand. Then again, maybe it's just hungry. You're just starting to think you've seen every flavor of medieval courtroom chaos when a new case spins the absurdity dial all the way to divine pest control. There's a chill in the church air this morning, thick with incense and indignation. You're not in a courthouse this time. You're in a cathedral, and the defendants, beetles. Yes, specifically, a colony of crop-eating weevils that has ravaged the town's barley stores, and the priest, cloaked in ceremonial vestments, is standing at the altar reading aloud a formal excommunication notice directed at the bugs. You shuffle closer, unsure if your ears are playing tricks on you. But there's no mistaking it. This is a legal case against insects, and it's being handled like any other ecclesiastical trial, with a scroll of charges, Latin prayers, and solemn witnesses who nod grimly as the priest calls the weevils agents of destruction. To us, it sounds like satire, but this was real. In many parts of medieval Europe, when pests invaded crops or vermin swarmed granaries, the church didn't just call the exterminator, they summoned canon law. Because if God governed all creatures, then surely even bugs could be reasoned with, or, failing that, punished. It wasn't limited to weevils either. Snails, rats, locusts, whole species were hauled into court in absentia and declared enemies of the spiritual order. Some records describe lengthy court procedures. Others skip straight to curses and holy threats. A particularly strange account from 1519 Switzerland describes a bishop who issued a cease and desist to a horde of field mice. They were granted a grace period to leave peacefully. When they didn't, the church escalated, cursing them with damnation and disease, unless they fled. Spoiler, they didn't. What's even more curious, the defendants, yes, the bugs, were often assigned lawyers. Human lawyers who would argue that the pests were simply obeying natural law, not malicious intent. Some even claimed that exiling an entire species from one region was unjust. It denied them the right to survive. A real legal theory called jus naturae was invoked. Animals, including insects, had the right to exist in nature. It's hard not to chuckle when you imagine a weevil sitting politely at a defense bench, but you also begin to grasp how desperate people must have been. A ruined harvest wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence for a village, and if divine order had been disturbed, if sins had multiplied unseen, then maybe these tiny creatures were just the messengers, or the punishment. And so, the clergy tried to reason with them, plead, threaten, even bribe. In some instances, entire ceremonies were held to banish the insects with holy water and smoke. Monks would walk in procession around the fields, chanting psalms while wagging censers at rows of half-eaten grain, a sort of heavenly pest removal service. This idea, of bugs being sentient enough to obey or defy baffles modern scholars. Some argue the trials were symbolic, a coping mechanism for powerlessness. Others insist that the blend of theology and legal precedent meant that even absurd logic could be ritualized into something comfortingly official. Still others suggest that these acts weren't taken literally, that they were more like prayers disguised as court cases. As the priest finishes reading the sentence, declaring the weevils excommunicated from the parish, the congregation murmurs and Amen. You glance around. No one seems skeptical. No one laughs, because in a world of mystery and misery, even the tiniest adversaries had to be acknowledged, publicly, formally. And if that meant a church trial for bugs, well, that was just another day in the life. You step outside into the sunlight, half expecting to see a line of beetles respectfully evacuating the fields. No such luck. The weevils are still there. And now, technically, they're heretics. By now, you're almost numb to the strangeness. You've seen pigs hanged, goats tried, and beetles excommunicated. But then, under the midday sun and the low whine of flies, you stumble into a field buzzing with gossip. A cow is under arrest. That's right, a cow. And not for your typical medieval livestock crimes like trampling a shrine or scaring the priest's horse. No, this one's accused of killing a man. A tragic goring, they say. A broken horn. A crushed rib cage. But it's not the death alone that makes this case peculiar. It's the underlying question being asked in the town square. Was it an accident or murder? The cow stands quietly near a cart, munching on clover, completely unbothered by the drama unfolding around it. But the villagers are abuzz. It had that look, one woman insists. Dark eyes. Not right. Another claims the cow had grown restless in recent weeks. An omen, surely. You stand amid them, catching whispers of curses, sin, and divine justice. When the makeshift trial begins, the court is assembled in a barn, of all places. Hay bales serve as benches. A magistrate adjusts his robes while swatting away flies. And the cow's owner stands beside the accused, clearly rattled. Losing a cow is no small thing, especially if it's found guilty and sentenced to death. This isn't just superstition. There's precedent. Legal codes from the time, including echoes of Roman law, actually detail protocols for holding animals responsible for violent acts. Cattle were expensive, but not above justice. If they killed a person, particularly under unusual or aggressive circumstances, a trial was warranted. If the animal was found malicious, it could be executed. Its carcass often burned or buried, never eaten. Nobody wanted to risk ingesting cursed meat. The cow, like the pig before her, has a lawyer. He doesn't wear fancy robes, just a sweat-stained tunic and the weary look of a man used to arguing with the absurd. He tries to reason that the man was drunk, that he fell awkwardly, that the cow had no motive, no mens rea, if you like. But motive doesn't seem to matter much to this crowd. A priest steps forward, holding a crucifix. He begins speaking of the cow's soul, or lack thereof. This is the fringe part. Some believed animals, especially domesticated ones, absorbed human sin through proximity. If a household had grown sinful, maybe the cow reflected that. Maybe she didn't act alone. One local tale mentions a rooster who pecked out a man's eye after being fed cursed grain. Another speaks of a goat who burst into flames after nibbling a relic. Whether anyone truly believed these stories is up for scholarly debate. Some say they were cautionary tales. Others think they were desperate ways to explain tragedy in a world short on logic and long on fear. And then, right before sentencing, comes a moment you didn't expect. The cow's owner breaks down sobbing. He begs for mercy, not for himself, but for the cow. She nursed my son when his mother died, he says. She's gentle. She's ours. His voice cracks. This was an accident. You'd think that might sway the court, but no. The magistrate frowns. He nods once. Guilt is declared. Sentence, death by axe. No gallows, no noose, just the block. You watch as the cow is led to the edge of the pasture. She's not resisting. She doesn't understand, of course. Or maybe she does. In that eerie way, animals sometimes seem to sense tension. Either way, the result is the same. A clean strike, a terrible silence, and then a collective sigh from the crowd. as if a great sin has been scrubbed from their collective soul. And you realize something else. This trial wasn't about the cow at all. It was about the people, their grief, their fear, their desperate need to restore order. Later that week, you find yourself in a small, wind-blown village on the edge of a crumbling forest. The townsfolk here are quieter, more suspicious, and the mood is oddly heavy, as if everyone's holding their breath. At first glance, it seems like another ordinary day. Chickens peck lazily at the dirt, a child rolls a hoop along a rutted path, and you're starting to think, maybe, just maybe, there won't be a trial today. Then you hear someone shout, "The rooster has laid an egg." And just like that, everyone panics. A rooster has laid an egg. Now, to you, that might just sound biologically confused. But in the medieval mindset, this was witchcraft of the highest order. Roosters were male. Eggs came from hens. So, a rooster laying an egg? That meant sorcery. Possibly Satan. Definitely trouble. You trail the crowd to the village chapel, where the rooster, an unimpressive, slightly bedraggled bird, is being held in a woven cage. It clucks and flutters, thoroughly confused, but the people around you are in full crisis mode. The local priest is consulting a dusty book of demonic signs. A magistrate is already muttering about unnatural acts. The rooster is about to stand trial, not for murder, not for theft, but for violating the natural order. You manage to catch a few lines from the priest's open book. According to older lore, particularly spread by 13th century demonologists, a rooster's egg was considered the starting ingredient for a basilisk, a deadly, serpent-like creature capable of killing with a glance. If the egg were to be hatched by a toad under the light of a full moon, yes, really, the result would be catastrophic. So even the potential for a rooster-laid egg was enough to justify swift, severe action. This bird, they say, is an existential threat. The quirky detail? Some towns kept elaborate records of such occurrences. There are accounts from Poland, the Netherlands, and even parts of Germany where roosters were formally accused, tried, and burned alive for this act. And while some suggest it was all symbolic, the fear was often very real. In this trial, the defense attorney does his best to argue that the egg might have been planted. Perhaps it belonged to a hen, mistaken in the chaos. But the townsfolk aren't listening. The priest keeps pointing at the rooster's red comb, muttering something about hell's crown. And then, suddenly, the scholarly debate spills into the open. One old man argues that roosters can't lay eggs. It's impossible. So either the whole thing's a misunderstanding, or the rooster is a demon in disguise. Someone else, clearly more versed in fringe natural history, says that once in a generation, a malformed rooster might produce something like an egg due to a deformity. This sparks a brief, very heated argument between two elderly women about poultry anatomy. But logic doesn't stand a chance here. Fear has already won. The sentence is declared. The rooster must die. Not by hanging, but by fire. Only flames, they say, can cleanse something so unnatural. The villagers build a small pyre just outside town. The rooster, still clucking weakly, is bound and placed on top. The priest sprinkles holy water. The executioner, yes, there's a guy whose job this specifically is, lights the kindling. You want to look away. You want this to be some kind of performance. But the smoke curls upward, thick and acrid, and the townspeople watch in solemn silence. Some cross themselves. A few children cry. The crowd slowly disperses, and one woman says aloud, "Now, the harvest may yet be saved." As if the bird, this poor confused rooster, had been the hinge between ruin and redemption. It's hard to grasp how deeply embedded these beliefs were. Scholars today argue endlessly about whether these were symbolic gestures or true legal beliefs. Was the rooster a scapegoat for agricultural anxiety? A stand-in for the devil himself? Or just the latest victim of a system that needed something, anything, to blame? Either way, the ashes are real. And the rooster, once mistaken for a miracle, is now just smoke on the wind. You're trudging through thick mud now, boots sucking at the earth with every step, following yet another whisper of a trial. This one's said to be especially strange, not for the crime, but for the defense. You arrive in a hilltop town just as a cowbell rings to summon the villagers. A hush spreads like fog as people gather near the chapel steps. The cues this time? You guessed it. Another pig. But what makes today different is the man standing beside it, tall, composed, and holding a worn leather satchel filled with scrolls and stamped parchments, the pig's lawyer. He steps forward and bows to the court with the flair of someone who's done this before, because, brace yourself, he has. This man is a trained animal advocate, a specialist in one of the strangest niches of medieval law, the defense of beasts. In some parts of France and Switzerland, defending animals became something of a legal sub-profession. These weren't con artists or court jesters. These were scholars, legally bound to uphold the same standards of argumentation as any human defense. Their job was to protect the rights of animals accused of crime, to make sure no sentence was passed without fair representation. The pig today is accused of despoiling the sanctuary. That's fancy language for busting into the church, knocking over a sacred chalice, and defecating in front of the altar. And while yes, that sounds like something only an untrained barn animal could do, the townsfolk are whispering about signs and omens. The prosecutor calls witnesses who describe the pig's ungodly noises and claims this was no accident. The pig, they say, was guided by dark forces. Then the defense attorney rises. His voice is calm, rehearsed. He argues that pigs, while often misunderstood, are highly intelligent, that they respond to fear and noise, and this one was likely startled. He points out that the church doors were left open, that the animal wandered in, not out of malice, but curiosity. Then comes the quirky bit. The lawyer reads aloud from a prior case, an 1386 defense in which a sow was spared execution due to respectful behavior during proceedings. Yes, really. The pig reportedly stood still during trial, didn't grunt excessively, and faced its accusers with dignity. That became legal precedent. The attorney today is trying to use that, and the magistrate seems to be listening. You glance around at the villagers. Some nod, others cross their arms. There's tension here, but also fatigue. This is the third animal trial this month. People want justice, yes, but they also want closure, an excuse to go home, to believe the world still makes sense. The defense pivots. He begins to frame the pig as a moral being, capable of confusion, but not of intent. He reminds the crowd that if humans sin and can repent, animals, driven by instinct, shouldn't be judged as if they possess free will. And here's where scholars still scratch their heads. Some records suggest that medieval lawyers genuinely tried to establish animal moral character in court, not just behavior, but intentions. Others think these arguments were part of a broader theater, a way for society to process grief, fear, and guilt through ritualized storytelling. Either way, the crowd is now leaning in. The pig, perhaps sensing the attention, snorts loudly. A child giggles. The judge raises an eyebrow. The final verdict? Surprisingly lenient. The pig is found guilty, but spared execution. Instead, it will be branded and removed from the parish. Banished, but not killed. You watch as the lawyer gently places a cloth over the pig's head before leading it away. He nods once to the crowd, scrolls tucked under his arm like he's just finished another Tuesday. And maybe he has, because in this bizarre chapter of history, there were men whose job it was to defend animals in court, to argue their case, to remind a terrified, superstitious population that even in madness, rules must be followed. It's not justice as you know it. But here, it's the only kind that exists. You arrive in the next village, just as a heated argument spills out from the tavern onto the cobblestones. The baker is red-faced, shouting about the accused being innocent, while the blacksmith shakes his fist and bellows, "It's justice! Justice for little Margot." You follow the commotion until it leads you to the square, where, to your disbelief, a trial is being held not because of a crime, but because of a crowd, or rather, to calm one. This time, the accused is a mangy dog, thin and nervous, chained to a post with a blank, tired look in its eyes. The crime? Knocking over a child near the river, who hit her head and later died of fever. No one actually saw it happen. The girl may have tripped. She may have been sick already. But grief needs something to aim at, and the dog happened to be there. As you watch, it becomes clear this trial isn't about justice at all. It's about tension. The villagers are restless. The harvest has failed. There's been a rash of sickness. People want someone or something to blame. And so, the dog, unlucky and unloved, has become the focus of their frustration. This isn't unique. In many cases, animal trials served a social purpose more than a legal one. They offered a release valve for fear and anger, a way to keep chaos from erupting into violence against people. Better to blame the pig, the goat, the dog, than to accuse the priest or the mayor. You hear the prosecutor lean into this sentiment, saying, "This beast represents the disorder among us." It's vague, purposefully so, because this isn't about one dog. It's about everything else. The storm that destroyed the wheat, the cough that took 3 infants, the sense that life is spiraling. The defense lawyer, barely more than a local clerk, tries to reason with the court. He points out that no one witnessed the incident, that the child may have been dizzy, or struck by fever, or simply unlucky. But logic doesn't carry much weight today. And then comes the fringe detail. The village elders recall a bad omen from the dog's arrival months ago. A raven perched on its kennel, a cracked hoofprint outside the chapel. They stitched together old wives' tales and cloudy memories to justify what they already feel, that someone must be punished. One scholar might call this a community's need for catharsis. Another might describe it as legalized scapegoating. There's no consensus really, just a long debate about how deeply the population believed in these trials versus how much they needed them. As the judge prepares to deliver the verdict, you feel the crowd tighten. People clutch each other's arms. The tension is physical. Guilty. The dog is sentenced to be drowned in the village pond. The blacksmith exhales loudly. The baker nods, though his hands are shaking. The mother of the dead child begins to cry, not out of relief, but grief. It's clear this won't actually fix anything, but in a strange way, it has brought the town together. Mourning, anger, confusion, all wrapped up in one doomed animal. You walk with the villagers to the pond. The dog doesn't resist. A small stone is tied around its neck with twine. It looks around one last time, ears twitching at the sound of birds, then steps forward. The splash is small. The silence after, massive. No cheers, no closure, just the brief illusion of order restored. And you realize this wasn't really a trial. It was a ritual, a way for a frightened town to convince itself that justice still existed, even when the world said otherwise. By now, you're starting to pick up on the rhythm of things. There's a kind of grim choreography to these trials. The charges, the public outrage, the solemn declarations, and the steady march toward punishment. But just when you think you've seen the full spectrum of medieval absurdity, you arrive in a monastery where the accused is not an animal, but an entire species. Monks, red-eyed from lack of sleep and possibly too much incense, have assembled before the abbot to present their case. The local rats have overrun the granary. Not exactly groundbreaking. Rats eat grain. That's kind of their thing. But this monastery, located deep in the Burgundy countryside, isn't just filing a complaint. They're preparing a formal legal case against the rats themselves. They're taking them to court, and no, not metaphorically. A cleric unfurls a scroll and begins reading a list of charges: theft, destruction of property, and spiritual harm through the denial of food to the poor. The monks nod solemnly. One even holds up a chunk of chewed-through sackcloth, as if it's Exhibit A. The defense? Oh, there is one. A lawyer has been summoned, by letter no less, from a neighboring province. His job? To represent the rat population in absentia. His name is Bartholomew Chassenet, and yes, he is a real historical figure. In 1510, he famously defended rats in Autumn, France, in a case nearly identical to the one unfolding before your eyes. Here's the quirky part. Chassenet was so skilled that his legal career launched from this case. He argued that the rats had the right to be properly summoned, just like human defendants. And because they lived in many different areas, his brilliant legal trick was to claim they needed more time to arrive. When pressed further, he added that travel was dangerous for the rats because cats roamed the roads, threatening their safety. Therefore, until a cat-free travel guarantee could be issued, the rats could not be expected to appear. It sounds like satire, but it worked. In the case you're watching now, the modern lawyer, clearly inspired by Chassenet, makes a similar plea. He argues that the rats are not individuals, but a collective, that their offense was survival, not malice, and that crucially, they too are God's creatures, fulfilling their purpose in the natural order. The monks are not impressed, nor is the abbot. whose voice echoes down the long stone hall as he declares the rats excommunicated from the abbey and all its lands. They are to be cursed by name, their entry forbidden, their spiritual standing revoked. That's right, spiritual standing. Because part of this trial isn't just about property or loss, it's about morality. These rats, by depriving the monastery of food, are seen as obstructing the path to charity. And that's a sin. No one really expects the rats to leave. They don't even know they've been cursed. But the ceremony matters. The formal process, the illusion of control. In a world where plague might strike without warning, where lightning could kill your priest mid-sermon, where children died from eating spoiled rye, you needed rituals, even absurd ones. Scholars today still debate whether these trials were symbolic acts or serious legal practices. Some call them social theater, ways of reinforcing moral order. Others argue that the church truly believed it could wield power over all creation, right down to the lowest flea. Chassenay himself seemed to believe both. He was a devout man, but also a cunning lawyer who saw opportunity in absurdity. As the trial concludes, incense wafts over the assembled monks. The scroll is sealed, the curse recorded in the monastery's legal ledger, and somewhere, back in the granary, the rats go about their business. Utterly unaffected by their excommunication, you follow the crowd out into the twilight. Someone mutters, "Maybe the curse will work this time." Someone else suggests setting traps. But you've just watched an entire species be tried by law. And not for the last time. You are barely out of the monastery before another tale reaches your ears. This one whispered more than shouted, as if the speaker isn't sure whether it's a legal matter or a ghost story. A nearby village has recently endured a terrible event. A man was found dead, seemingly trampled and torn. But there was no thief, no highwayman, no lurking outlaw in the woods. Only a mule. You're half expecting another trial, but this time the villagers aren't gathering in the square or summoning lawyers. They've done something different, something older. They've buried the mule, not in the ground, but in salt, face covered, eyes bound, and tucked away in an abandoned barn like a dangerous secret. You sneak in to see it, stiff, silent, strangely peaceful, but something about it feels wrong, even to you. Turns out this particular village follows an older tradition, one from the more rural and folklore-infused corners of medieval Europe. When an animal killed a person but no clear evil could be found, people sometimes believed the animal itself had been possessed, not just angry or confused, but overtaken by malevolent forces. The mule didn't act alone. Something acted through it. So instead of trial by court, this mule got trial by superstition. You hear from the local priest that a ceremony was performed, candles lit, salt circles laid, holy water sprinkled in a wide perimeter. The villagers stood watch, reciting psalms. It wasn't excommunication, it was exorcism. Yes, for a mule. This wasn't actually uncommon, especially in border regions where folklore bled into Christian ritual. Some creatures, particularly those that served in close contact with humans, horses, mules, oxen, were believed to be susceptible to spiritual corruption. If one suddenly turned violent, it might be seen as the vessel of a wandering soul, or a demon displaced from a sinful person. There's a record from 4223 Normandy that describes a possessed sheep that screamed in the tongue of a child after goring its owner. Another tale from Saxony tells of a donkey that ran headlong into a chapel wall and died on the altar, a sign, they claimed, of unclean spirits. No one can prove these stories were taken entirely literally. Modern historians argue whether these events were true beliefs, local performances of power, or simply misunderstandings of animal behavior and trauma. But whatever their origin, they were serious to the people involved. The mule's death didn't end the ritual. After the salting, it will be left for 3 days, then burned, not as a punishment, but to release whatever may have lingered inside. Its ashes will be buried beneath a pile of church stones. The priest says this will seal its spirit from returning. You glance around at the villagers gathered in silence. Some look scared, some relieved. A few children clutch their parents' cloaks tightly. It's more than grief. It's fear that the boundary between the living and the not quite dead has been crossed, that something unnatural stepped briefly into their world and wore the skin of a beast. Even in death, the mule has become a symbol, a warning, a scapegoat, not in the legal sense, but in the oldest way. A creature burdened with sin, cast out so the rest may go on. And as the barn doors close and the priest finishes his final words, the crowd disperses not with satisfaction, but with caution. No verdict was read, no law invoked, but justice, in its strangest form, has been served. You stand there for a long while, alone now, with the salted corpse of a beast who never knew it was accused. Because sometimes, in this world, you didn't need to be guilty. You just needed to exist at the wrong time. You leave that cursed barn behind, trudging down a dusty road lined with crooked trees and the heavy scent of damp straw. The air feels different now, like the ridiculousness of all the pig trials, and rooster accusations has curdled into something darker, more desperate. And just when you think things can't possibly get more surreal, you arrive in a town where the accused isn't a pig, or a rat, or even a demon-possessed mule. It's a swarm of bees. The village square is nearly empty, save for a group of men in robes gathered around a table covered in jars, some of which buzz ominously. The bees are not present, of course, but their representatives are. This trial, as the scribe solemnly explains to no one in particular, is for the murder of a man named Alaric. He had wandered into a glade, disturbed a hive, and been stung to death. Normally you'd call that a tragic accident, nature doing what nature does, but this town, they've decided the bees acted with hostility. So naturally, they must be tried. You sit down beside a tired-looking shepherd who offers you a drink and tells you the whole village is frightened. 3 bad harvests, a sickly winter, and now this. Alaric wasn't just any man, you see. He was a deacon, a man of God. So for him to die by bees, clearly unnatural, maybe even orchestrated. In the medieval worldview, this was more than superstition. Bees weren't just insects. They were symbols of divine order. Some even believed that bees hummed prayers. There are manuscripts filled with bee lore, beekeeping monks writing about hives as metaphors for human society, queens as sovereigns, workers as clergy, drones as idlers. The hive was a mirror of the medieval world. So for a hive to kill a clergyman, that wasn't just aggression. It was rebellion. The prosecutor begins his statement with a sermon-like gravity, declaring that the bees of Birch Hollow have broken the law of God and of man. You suppress the urge to laugh. Everyone else is dead serious. The defense lawyer, yes, even bees get one, stands up and argues that bees act only in defense, that Alaric disturbed them, that no intent can be proven, and then, hilariously, he pivots into natural law again, arguing that bees cannot sin because they cannot choose. He even quotes Aristotle. The debate goes back and forth for nearly an hour. Witnesses describe the buzzing. The priest insists the stings formed a pattern on Alaric's skin that resembled a serpent. Someone brings forward a piece of wax shaped eerily like a skull. You're not sure if it's coincidence or collective hysteria, but at this point, logic has left the building. Eventually, the judge pronounces the bees guilty. Not because they understood what they did, but because their continued presence threatens to repeat it. The sentence? Exile. Yes, you heard that right. The bees are to be banished from the region. Now, how exactly do you exile bees? That's the fringe part. The villagers construct a small wooden raft, place a chunk of the hive on it, along with a scroll listing their crimes, and push it out into the river. A sort of insect Ark of the Covenant, drifting away into the reeds. A few bees buzz lazily around the jars as this happens. No one dares swat them. The symbolism is too rich, too holy. The people watch in silence as the raft disappears downstream. A murmur passes through the crowd. Now the curse will lift. Someone drops to their knees and prays. And just like that, the tension in the town seems to ease. The bees, real or imagined, have been judged. The order has been restored. You lean against the stone wall of the square, still stunned. This wasn't just justice. It was an exorcism disguised as law. A trial not of bees, but of fate itself. And once again, the only thing that mattered was appearance. Ritual. The illusion that even when nature lashes out, humanity has a say. And for now, in this sleepy, slightly absurd corner of the world, it seems they do. You don't even bother asking where you're going next anymore. The path seems to choose you, guiding your weary feet from one corner of medieval absurdity to the next. Today it leads you to a valley wrapped in silence, where the only sounds are wind and the rhythmic creak of a watermill, and sobbing. You find a boy, no older than 10, curled beside a goat tethered to a stake. His face is blotched and tear-streaked. The goat, calm and glassy-eyed, chews aimlessly, blissfully unaware that it is about to be tried for sorcery. You sit beside an old woman on a crooked bench, and she tells you the story. The boy's younger sister had fallen ill, fever, convulsions, screaming at night. The healer blamed bad air, but the priest? He saw something darker. He claimed the goat had been seen circling the house 3 times, bleeding at midnight. Unnatural behavior, he said, a sign that it had been bewitched, or worse, was the source of bewitchment. Now the goat is accused of casting spells. The villagers gather slowly, murmuring about the evil eye and sour milk, and a rooster that hasn't crowed in days. The signs, they say, are all around. And the goat? Well, it looked at someone funny once. Case closed. You brace yourself for the performance. And sure enough, the makeshift trial begins with a prayer, a shout, and a dramatic reading from Deuteronomy. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. No one questions the leap from human sorcery to caprine crime. The crowd has already decided something dark is afoot. The prosecution brings forward evidence. Hoofprints near the girl's bed. A patch of wool that smells strange. A witness who claims to have seen the goat blinking unusually fast. You're pretty sure that last one says more about the witness than the goat. Then the priest reveals his trump card. The goat was seen standing on its hind legs. Gasps ripple through the crowd. A farmer drops his pipe. The boy sobs harder. Standing, of course, is something goats can do, especially when tempted with a bucket of turnip peels. But logic, as you've learned, has very little power here. The goat's defense is thin. A tired elder speaks up, pointing out that the animal has always been docile, that it's nursed kids, given milk, never hurt a soul. But he's drowned out by superstition. The slow burn of fear fanned into flames by hunger, disease, and months of bad luck. Then comes the fringe tidbit. One of the villagers insists that the girl's fevered muttering sounded like the goat's name. The implication is clear. The animal was summoned by her unconscious spirit, or perhaps it answered a call from the underworld. Even modern scholars shake their heads at these moments in the records. Was this simply rural panic? A communal hallucination? Or did some truly believe that animals could house demonic energy? Some argue that these cases were echoes of older pagan beliefs, where animals had spiritual roles, twisted by Christian doctrine into warnings of witchcraft. Others suggest it was nothing more than scapegoating, with frightened communities projecting their helplessness onto the nearest creature. Whatever the truth, the goat is condemned. Not for what it did, but for what it represented. Disorder, fear, the uncomfortable truth that not every fever has a cause you can see or blame. The priest leads the sentence himself, a single, swift blow. The goat slumps, its body still, its silence final. The boy lets out a cry that sounds too old for his tiny lungs, and as you turn away, a terrible thought flickers in your mind. In trying to banish evil, they have only deepened the wound. The girl is still sick, the land is still barren, but now the goat is gone, and the villagers can sleep a little easier, wrapped in the illusion that evil has been conquered. You walk on, but the boy's sobs stay with you, because sometimes a trial isn't about truth, or even belief. It's about control. The next village comes into view just as the sky bruises with dusk, casting the crooked roofs in gold and shadow. You think maybe there won't be a trial today. Maybe you've wandered into a place where animals are just animals, and no one is preparing a noose for a goose or swearing that a beetle's soul can be damned. But as you pass under a rickety wooden arch, you hear a soft chant. It echoes from the chapel on the hill, solemn and rhythmic. Another trial, of course, but this one isn't like the others. The accused lies motionless in the square, its fur ruffled, one paw limp. A cat, a dead cat, and yet they're still holding court. You move closer, feeling the weight of ritual in the air. A few robed clerics stand in a loose circle. Villagers line the perimeter, heads bowed, expressions unreadable. There's no shouting, no frantic accusation, only the low hum of Latin prayer. The priest announces that the cat has been found guilty posthumously of consorting with witches. Apparently, it was seen lingering outside a woman's home just days before she was caught gathering herbs at dusk. Suspicious herbs. The kind that don't cure, but curse. So the story goes. It's easy to scoff at first. Trial for a corpse? But the priest continues, explaining that justice must be visible, even if it's no longer functional. The cat's body, he says, is tainted. It cannot be buried. It must be burned to sever the spiritual tether between the creature and the evil it may have channeled. You watch as the priest lifts a small cross, pauses for a moment of silence, then steps back. Villagers begin placing straw and broken boards beneath the cat's body. A child whispers something and is quickly hushed. The wind changes. You catch the smell of thyme, then smoke. Flames rise. And here's where the history gets particularly strange. Scholars do have records of dead animals being tried, or at least condemned, especially cats. In fact, in certain regions, like 15th century France or parts of the Holy Roman Empire, black cats were so tightly linked to witchcraft that they were burned en masse during cleansing rituals. Their bodies weren't evidence. They were proof. This cat, they say, was too quiet, too smart. It watched people. It followed people. And in a time where behavior was often more important than biology, those were grounds enough. One fringe belief from the late medieval period held that witches could project themselves into animals, especially cats, and spy, sabotage, or even attack without ever leaving their beds. This idea, known as the familiar spirit, became central in later witch trials, where even a pet seen licking a hand was considered a sign of a pact with the devil. So it's no surprise that when a woman is accused of witchcraft, her animals are rarely far behind, and sometimes they go first. You stay until the fire dies down. Ashes swirl into the sky, disappearing into the violet clouds. The villagers say nothing as they return to their homes. The priest mutters a final benediction, then walks away, sandals scraping on stone. There's no verdict, no sentence, just smoke. And that's what makes this trial stand out. It wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about making a statement that evil has no place here, that even the dead will be punished if they've strayed too far. You linger for a moment, staring at the empty pyre. You think about how cats in Egypt were once revered, mummified, worshipped, and now, in this place and time, they're feared, hunted, set ablaze not because of what they are, but because of what people think they might mean. And perhaps that's the scariest part of all. You don't even need to be alive to be guilty. You've grown numb to it all. The absurdity, the sorrow, the stink of sweat and smoke. But this last place, tucked high in a mossy corner of the mountains, holds a final chapter stranger than any before. Here, the accused are insects, not metaphorical pests, not individual troublemakers, but an entire squirming, writhing species. The townsfolk call them cropworms, though the name is generous. These creatures, tiny, almost invisible to the eye, have ruined every cabbage, every stalk of barley, every green thing the village owns. And so they've been summoned. By court, you stand in the field where the trial is to be held. A wooden podium leans precariously in the mud. A scroll flutters in the breeze. A priest holds a Bible. A bailiff, yes, a bailiff, swats at a gnat while solemnly reading the summons aloud. Let the worms of the valley of Saint-Prix present themselves before the court on the third day hence, to answer for crimes against the harvest, under penalty of excommunication and expulsion. You're not sure what's more unbelievable, the fact that the worms have been summoned, or that someone expects them to respond. But this isn't satire. This is medieval France, and this trial is real. Over the next 3 days, rituals are performed, candles lit, bells rung, and tiny flags placed along the edges of the field to mark the perimeter of the courtroom. The villagers come out each day to witness the proceedings, though the accused remain invisible, and yet the trial continues. The priest declares the case. The worms have acted contrary to the laws of God and nature by destroying food destined for the faithful. He quotes scripture, then leans into a curious bit of fringe theology, suggesting that perhaps the worms are divine punishment for hidden sins. A debate breaks out. Is this a legal proceeding against animals, or a spiritual reckoning through them? One scholar, centuries later, would describe these trials as a bizarre cross between environmental management and folk religion. Another would argue they were proto-ecological, revealing a pre-modern struggle to assert dominion over natural forces through ritual. But here, in this moment, it feels like desperation. The villagers are starving. The rains came late. The wind snapped half the apple trees, and now these tiny, unstoppable mouths have eaten everything else. They've turned fear into a face, even if it's one you need a magnifying glass to see. The lawyer for the defense, a traveling notary who probably thought he'd be mediating land disputes, stands and delivers a surprisingly thoughtful speech. He argues that the worms, like humans, are merely seeking sustenance, that they are creatures of God, and must be respected as such. He even proposes a compromise, setting aside a portion of the field for the worms to inhabit, an early form of pest zoning. The court considers this. Yes, really. And in one of the more surreal rulings of your entire journey, the judge agrees. A strip of land, rocky, poor, and already half devoured, is designated as a worm refuge. The rest of the field is to be blessed, protected, and ritually closed to insect incursion. The worms are officially banished. Of course, they don't listen. Within days, the blessed fields are crawling with larvae. But for the villagers, the point wasn't success. It was the gesture, the ritual, the reassurance that even the smallest force in nature can be named, summoned, judged. That justice, however symbolic, is not just for kings and men and wayward pigs. It's for everything. As night falls, you wander from the village, your boots coated in mud, and your head full of strange memories. You've seen pigs hanged, bees banished, and worms sued in court, and somehow, it all made sense. In a medieval, moonlit, incense-scented kind of way. Because when life is uncertain, and justice feels out of reach, people will grasp for any shape it can take, even if it means dragging a grasshopper to trial. And now, the fire has faded, the fields have gone quiet, and the last absurd whisper of a trial has drifted off into the wind. You lie back on that patch of cool earth in your mind, eyes half closed, ears full of forgotten bells and echoing verdicts. Maybe a pig once stood trial in a chapel, maybe a lawyer defended a swarm of mice, or maybe it was all just a strange dream passed down through dusty manuscripts and candlelit stories. Either way, you made it. You survived a world where even your cat could be excommunicated, and where a swarm of worms might end up in court. So breathe deeply now. Let the smoke clear, let the voices fade, let the weight of strange old justice drift away like parchment ash in an autumn wind. You're safe now. No summons, no judgment, just sleep. Slow, quiet, peaceful sleep. Let your breath slow. Let your shoulders ease down, and rest, knowing that the strangest courts in history are long closed, and their creatures, great and small, finally still.